reverent, casting a halo over the polished floor of the stage. The audience had come expecting warmth, laughter, and maybe a few anecdotes about Capitol Hill politics. What they didn't expect was the storm quietly approaching in high heels. Steve Harvey stepped forward with his signature half-smile, but tonight his voice carried more weight. She's been called a disruptor, a troublemaker, even too loud for Congress, he said, pausing. But I call her what she truly is, a warrior for justice in a battlefield that was never built to protect her. Applause erupted, but Jasmine Crockett didn't soak it in. She walked out steady, poised, eyes sharp as glass. Her tailored navy blazer whispered authority, but the quiet strain beneath her smile told a different story. Of battles waged behind closed doors, of rooms where her voice was silenced before she ever opened her mouth. The kind of injustice that doesn't leave bruises on the skin, but carves deep fractures into the soul. She took her seat, but not before her eyes locked onto the small, silver crucifix hanging from Steve's neck. And just like that, something inside her shifted. Her breath caught, not visibly but internally, like someone stepping on a landmine of memory. For a split second, her mind wasn't in the studio. It was in the backseat of a car parked outside the Capitol, fists clenched around a crumpled folder marked "Motion Denied." It was in the echo of a Senate hallway where she had been called angry for demanding answers. It was in the trembling voice of a mother from Detroit who had begged her, sobbing to investigate her son's death, only to be told later by a senior colleague, "Don't waste your career on ghosts." Her pupils dilated. The applause faded into static. All she could see now was that crucifix, the same shape, the same size, as the one from a night she never wanted to speak of again. Steve leaned forward, still smiling, unaware. "Jasmine, welcome. We've been waiting for this moment." But Jasmine Crockett, the fighter, the flame, the name that kept senators up at night. She blinked slowly and smiled with grace, because something ancient had just stirred within her. And this was no longer just an interview. This was going to be a reckoning. And that crucifix, silent, still, gleaming faintly in the studio lights, didn't just catch her eye. It struck her like lightning held in silver. Jasmine blinked, but what she saw wasn't the stage, wasn't the crowd, wasn't even Steve. It was the cold tile of a bathroom floor in a DC apartment, the distant wail of sirens outside, and the unbearable stillness inside her chest. In that one glance, the stage became a battleground she'd already survived. She straightened, just enough to mask the quake in her breath, but something inside had shifted. Snapped, perhaps. The way glass doesn't shatter all at once, but from a single, perfect crack. Steve, oblivious to the war unfolding 2 feet away, smiled warmly and leaned into his next question. "So let's talk politics," he said, voice textured with curiosity. "You've clashed with governors, taken on billionaires, and stood your ground against Supreme Court justices. What keeps you going?" Jasmine blinked once. Not from nerves, but calculation. How much could she say without burning every bridge behind her? She gave the expected answer, but her tone was anything but rehearsed. "Justice doesn't wait for comfort," she said, gaze locked. "It doesn't care if the room likes you. It cares if you show up anyway." The audience murmured in appreciation, but Jasmine didn't look at them. Her eyes were fixed on Steve's, or rather the space just below his collarbone. Her voice remained calm, but every syllable carried the weight of years. "I've walked into rooms where I wasn't just underestimated, I was unwelcome. I've had microphones cut, cameras pulled, notes stolen. I've had colleagues call me too emotional when I named murder for what it was." Her fingers tightened in her lap. "I've left hearings with handprints on my soul." Steve lowered his question card, the smile fading. He knew this wasn't the answer he had prepared for, and Jasmine wasn't done. Then silence. Not the kind that makes space for laughter, the kind that makes space for confession. "But today," she said, and her voice did something it hadn't done all evening. It trembled, just slightly, like a bell struck from within. "I didn't come here to talk about legislation, or filibusters, or bills that die on purpose. She paused. A long pause. One breath. Two. Her jaw set, but her eyes had softened in a way that made the entire room hold its breath. I came here to say thank you. 1,000 camera lenses blinked. Steve leaned forward, quiet now, brows knitting in curiosity. Thank who? He asked gently, the light catching again on that crucifix. Jasmine's voice dropped to a whisper, but somehow it hit harder than anything she'd shouted in Congress. You, she said, thank you for something you once said that I wasn't supposed to hear, but I did, and it saved me. The moment after her words landed was so still, it felt like the entire room forgot how to breathe. The tension didn't dissipate. It crystallized, the way glass fogs just before it shatters. Jasmine sat motionless, her hands folded tightly, knuckles pale, as if they were the last barrier holding something volcanic inside her chest. Steve's expression had changed. He wasn't the host anymore. He was the witness. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. When truth walks into the room wearing scars, it doesn't need to shout. People think justice is elegant, she began, her tone sharp but unbearably composed. They think it's speeches and photo ops, tweets and triumphs. She turned her head slowly toward the audience. They never see the battlefield behind the podium. I've gotten letters, real letters, folded neat, postmarked, and filled with venom, she continued, her eyes narrowing like someone who'd memorized every threat word for word. Watch your back, you dirty fraud. Go back where you came from. We see you, and we're coming. Her voice didn't shake. That made it worse. I've opened my inbox and found pictures of lynching victims, with my name photoshopped in. Gasps rippled through the room, but Jasmine didn't blink. They put them under fake names, but they use real addresses, my family's addresses. Her fingers twitched in her lap. One night I had to leave through the back of my office because someone posted my location live and tagged it. Easy target. She let those words settle, like ash falling in a burned-out field. And then there's the quiet knives, she added, her voice dipping lower. The ones that smile when they cut you. She looked up, locking eyes with Steve now, not in confrontation but confession. I've had fellow lawmakers leak false stories about me to the press, then come hug me on the House floor like nothing happened. I've had staffers accidentally delete reports from my office drives. I've had donors call me a problem behind closed doors because I refuse to be palatable. Her voice tightened with cold precision. They don't want you to speak. They want you to smile, say the right things, take the photo, sign the bill, but don't feel, don't grieve, don't bleed. The silence grew unbearable, but Jasmine leaned into it like it was a pulpit. I stand up every day for those who've been silenced, she said, a flicker of something ancient behind her voice now. For mothers who buried sons with no justice, for children who study in classrooms with no heat and no hope, for communities that exist in the margins because power refuses to draw them a map. She paused not for drama, but because her breath caught, and she let it. But sometimes, after I've spent the day screaming for others, I come home and realize I've got nothing left for me. Her voice dropped to a whisper now, but somehow it carried farther. No prayers, no words, not even my own name. And then, after a heartbeat so loud it seemed to echo through the lights and cameras, she said it. That's the part they never show. The cost of being a voice when no one ever checks if you still have one. And after everything she had exposed, the calculated cruelty, the psychological warfare masked as politics, there was still one truth she hadn't touched. The room waited, unknowingly poised at the edge of something irreversible. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, as if the words she was about to speak came not from memory, but from an old wound that had never quite closed. Her voice dropped an octave, slower now, measured. Not from uncertainty, but from reverence. You want to know the truth? She said. The one I never wrote in any op-ed, never said on the floor of Congress? She paused just long enough for the silence to lean in. There was a night, she began, when I didn't think I would survive my own purpose. Her hands remained still, but her chest rose with a breath that felt earned, not automatic. It was after a hearing on qualified immunity, she continued, the words tasting like metal. I sat there for hours being talked over, mocked, by men who hadn't buried children from their districts, hadn't held grieving mothers, hadn't seen the autopsy photos I had memorized. Her eyes glazed, not from tears, but distance. I read names of black boys who never made it to high school. And when I was done, one senator looked me in the eye and said, "Thank you for your performance." Her lip curled, not in anger, in exhaustion. I walked out, didn't go to my office, didn't speak to staff, just grabbed my keys and drove. Her voice hardened into steel wrapped in velvet. No destination, just motion, just silence, just headlights and the sound of my own heart, which by that point felt more like a metronome ticking down to something I couldn't name. She looked past the audience now as if speaking to the road itself. I drove for 3 hours, through toll booths I don't remember passing, past exits I didn't read. I wasn't running from danger. I was running from the voice in my head that kept asking, "Are you still making a difference? Or are you just bleeding in public for applause?" Her fingers slowly intertwined. When I got home, I didn't go to bed. I sat on the kitchen floor, in full suit, heels still on, my knees against the cabinets, my back against the fridge like I was bracing for some invisible impact. The stillness in the room wasn't dramatic. It was sacred. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't move. Just sat there while the streetlight outside blinked through the window like some lazy heartbeat. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Then I did the thing that scared me most. I started writing goodbye. A beat. To my mother. She looked down at her lap, jaw tight. I told her I was sorry. Sorry for raising a daughter who only ever knew how to fight and didn't know how to stop. Her eyes lifted, empty now, like the aftershock of grief. I told her I was tired, not just in the body, in the soul. And then, with a voice no louder than the rustle of breath, she said the words that cracked the air in half. My phone fell out of my coat pocket, hit the floor, the screen lit up, just for a second. She inhaled, her throat quivering. That was the only light in the room. And just when the weight of the silence felt final, when the cold from the tile beneath her had numbed her legs, and the thoughts circling her mind had turned from sharp to empty, something happened. A dim pulse of light blinked against the kitchen cabinet like a whisper in a locked room. Jasmine didn't move. Her hands were still clenched in her lap, her breath barely rising. But her eyes shifted. The screen of her phone, still cracked from a fall months earlier, flickered to life, casting a pale glow across the room. No text, no call, just an algorithm's random mercy. YouTube, mid-autoplay, a shaky recording, low resolution, a dark stage, and then his voice. The room didn't change, but the air inside her did. Steve Harvey appeared on that tiny screen, barely lit by a lone spotlight above him. He wasn't performing. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't telling jokes. He stood like a man carrying something holy, one hand gripping the mic, the other pressed over his chest as if holding a wound. And then he spoke. Not to the audience in that room, not to the internet, not to the thousands who might stumble across the clip someday, but somehow, impossibly, directly to her. If you're at the lowest point in your life, his voice rang out, low and solemn. Don't go any lower. Don't dig. Don't sink. Just stay still. Jasmine stared, paralyzed. Because maybe, he continued, what you're standing in isn't a grave. Maybe it's a foundation. Maybe God is laying stone beneath you, so one day you can rise on something that holds. Her mouth parted slightly, breath caught in her throat like glass. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. Not yet. She simply replayed it. Once, twice, 3 times. And each time the same thing happened. That sentence carved through the darkness like a blade of light. She had heard 1,000 speeches, given hundreds, but nothing had ever spoken to her need. Not like this. Not at that exact second. On the 3rd replay, her shoulders trembled. One tear fell, then another. Not from despair, from recognition, from the unbearable sacred realization that someone she had never met had thrown her a rope in the very moment she had planned to let go. I wasn't looking for hope, she whispered, voice raw, stripped of armor. I was looking for an exit. Her eyes stayed locked on the screen. But those words gave me something even more terrifying than peace. They gave me pause. She swallowed, shaking her head slowly. And in that pause, I waited. She looked up then, locking eyes with Steve Harvey for the first time since she'd begun the story. And the next morning, I was still here. And as the final syllables escaped Jasmine's lips, the next morning, I was still here. A silence heavier than any applause settled over the room. No cameras moved. No audience member shifted. Time itself seemed to pause, as if the studio lights had dimmed in reverence for a truth too sacred to interrupt. Across from her, Steve Harvey sat paralyzed, not by shock, but by something more profound: revelation. The kind of revelation that pulls guilt from places you didn't know you carried, that floods your chest with questions you don't know how to answer. His body didn't move, but his breathing changed. Shallow now, almost imperceptible. The show, the stage, the schedule, all of it collapsed under the weight of what had just been said. Then slowly, like gravity had increased tenfold, Steve's right hand rose. Not for dramatic effect, not for television. It was instinct, pure, ancient, unfiltered. He reached for the crucifix that hung just beneath the fold of his lapel, the one that had become part of his public image, but had once been chosen in private desperation. His fingers curled around it, not like a man clutching a symbol, but like someone reaching for the only part of themselves still standing. The metal was warm from his skin, but it may as well have been fire. He bowed his head slightly, eyes no longer able to hold the weight of hers. A single tear broke free and slipped down his cheek. His voice, when it finally emerged, was fractured and faint. "I was just talking," he said, barely audible. "I was just trying to speak from the heart." He paused, breath stalling in his chest. "I didn't know it reached you." The words hung in the space between them, like a confession that had waited years to be spoken aloud. And in that moment, not a single camera, not a single spotlight could distract from what was happening. Steve Harvey, a man who had held the world's laughter in the palm of his hand, now sat speechless, humbled, hunted by grace, because what Jasmine had handed him wasn't gratitude. It was something far heavier. Proof. Proof that words matter, that even unplanned honesty could carve footholds into the lives of people who were slipping. He looked down at the cross again, hands still clenched around it like a man trying to make sense of his own role in a miracle. His lips trembled, but he did not cry for show. He cried because somewhere deep in the past, he had said something he thought would be forgotten. And today it stood in front of him, breathing. Jasmine didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it live, because she understood its purpose. Then gently, deliberately, she lifted her own hand and placed it over her chest. Her fingers splayed across her heart as if anchoring herself to the moment. Her voice, when it returned, had no quiver, only depth. "That's why it saved me," she said softly but with piercing clarity. "Because you didn't say it for applause. You didn't package it for inspiration. You weren't performing." She leaned in just slightly, not confrontational, but intimate. "You didn't know anyone was listening, and that's what made it real." Steve's eyes lifted then, slowly, and what he saw was not a congresswoman, not a political figure, not a guest on a talk show. He saw someone he had unknowingly pulled back from the edge with a few unrehearsed, soul-born words. His jaw tightened. A muscle in his cheek twitched. But still he said nothing. Because what could you possibly say to someone who just told you that your words interrupted a suicide note? Jasmine continued, her voice rich now, with both tenderness and devastation. "We live in a world where people monetize pain, Steve, where they weaponize faith, package trauma, turn suffering into content." Her hand pressed harder against her chest. "But that night, what you said wasn't content. It wasn't a clip. It wasn't entertainment." She paused, letting her breath settle. "It was a lifeline, thrown into the dark. No aim, no target, just honest, just true. And somehow it found me." The camera operators, trained professionals with years of live television under their belts, found their hands trembling behind the lens. Because what they were capturing wasn't a segment, it was testimony. Steve blinked once, and then again, as if trying to clear the fog from his vision, as if trying to unfeel something already embedded in his chest. His grip on the cross hadn't loosened. If anything, it had grown tighter, like he finally realized what he'd been wearing all these years. I didn't think it would matter, he whispered, more to himself than to her. It was just a moment. I didn't plan it, I just felt it, and I said it. Jasmine nodded. Exactly, she said, eyes steady, unsparing. That's why it broke through. Then her voice dropped, so low only he in the silence could truly hear it. You weren't trying to save anyone. A beat. And that's exactly why you did. Her words pierced like scripture, not because they were loud, but because they were earned. There was no theater in her tone, no performance in her gaze. Just truth, undressed, unprotected, unafraid. And in that moment, two lives once separated by platform, industry, and purpose were tied together by something infinitely rarer. Unintended salvation. Steve let go of the crucifix finally, slowly, almost reluctantly, like parting with something newly understood. His hand dropped back into his lap, but the weight remained. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. Not because he lacked the words, but because there were none adequate. Not yet. What he had offered the world had boomeranged back to him in the form of survival. And what Jasmine had just done was more than acknowledge it. She had sanctified it. And as the crucifix fell gently against Steve's chest, as the weight of unintended salvation wrapped the room in silence, Jasmine inhaled. Not because it was easy, but because what she was about to say had never been said out loud before. Not on any stage, not in any chamber, not even in the solitude of her own home. Her voice, when it returned, carried something different now. Not just pain, but origin. And like a river forced underground, it rose from a place deeper than memory. People always ask me why I got into politics, she began, her tone low, eyes drifting beyond the cameras. Some think it's ambition, others say it's fire, maybe anger. She let the words hang, then looked back at Steve with a stillness so sharp it cut the air. But the truth is, I didn't choose this fight. It chose me the day the system chose to take my sister. A hush moved through the studio, not from drama, but grief recognizing its own. Her name was Aaliyah, Jasmine said, and even saying it cracked something ancient inside her. 17 years old. Brilliant, kind, soft-spoken until she laughed. And when she laughed, the whole block smiled. She smiled faintly at the memory, but it died in an instant. She was walking home from tutoring, headphones in, hoodie up. It was cold that night, and the patrol car said she matched the description. Jasmine's voice remained steady, but her hands now clutched each other so tightly her knuckles blanched. The officer said she moved too fast, then said she didn't move fast enough, said she reached, said she was a threat. Her breath hitched, only once, before she forced it still again. What she reached for was her phone. What she got was a bullet to the chest. A gasp moved through the audience, but Jasmine didn't blink. I was on the phone with her when it happened, she said. I heard the shout, then the thud, then nothing. Her eyes burned, but she refused to look away. They put her in a plastic bag before I got to the hospital, treated her like evidence, like a threat that needed zipping up and filing away. Jasmine's voice was now edged with iron. They said it was a tragic misunderstanding. They said it was protocol. They said, these things happen. Her jaw locked. And that was the moment I understood. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as it was designed to. Steve's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. He was no longer a host. He was a mourner. I held her, Steve, Jasmine continued, softer now but more dangerous for it. Her body was still warm, and I remember whispering into her hair, I swear to God they will hear your name in every chamber I enter. She paused, a breath that sounded like it had been buried with Aaliyah, and I kept that promise. I ran for office with her obituary in my hand. I walked into Congress carrying her photo in my bag. Her voice now rose, not in volume, but in gravity. But I didn't walk in to make friends. I walked in to make noise. And the minute I did, the machine turned on me. She leaned in now, eyes blazing with a clarity that was both righteous and weary. They let me run, sure. But once I got there, they started trimming pieces of me off like I was too loud to belong. Her voice cracked, not in weakness, but in worn-out war. They told me to smile more, to soften my language, to stop making white men uncomfortable in hearings, to be less confrontational when reading the names of the dead. Her lips curled, not in anger, but in disbelief. I would speak truth into a microphone, and the network would clip my sentences, splice them out of context, turn my sister's memory into a headline. A beat. They tried to make me forget why I walked in that building in the first place. The room tightened with a silence that felt like mourning. And some days, I almost did, she admitted, eyes glossing. Some days I'd sit in my car after a hearing, after being talked over, ignored, reduced, and I'd wonder if I was making any difference at all. She looked at Steve, and her next words came like a breath she'd been holding for years. Because that's what the system does best. It doesn't always kill you with bullets. Sometimes it kills you with doubt. Her voice trembled now, but not from breaking, from carrying too much weight for too long. It makes you question your volume, your presence, your right to still be. Steve reached slightly forward in his seat, visibly struggling with what to say, his crucifix still hanging limp over his chest like a burden finally recognized. But Jasmine kept going. She had to. My sister's death made me pick up the sword, she said. But Steve, your words, that night on that tiny screen, they kept me from laying it down. Her voice dropped into a whisper, but it echoed like thunder. I was already bleeding in the arena. But that sentence, your sentence, reminded me why I walked in covered in scars to begin with. Then, with eyes sharp as her memory and voice steady as her grief, she finished the truth that no one had ever heard from her before. Aaliyah's death was the reason I started fighting. She paused, let the ache breathe. But you, Steve Harvey, you were the reason I kept fighting. No music, no applause, just silence. Holy, shattered, unforgettable. And as the echo of Jasmine's final confession hung between them, you were the reason I kept fighting. Steve Harvey didn't speak. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at a burning building from which someone just walked out alive. No applause, no camera shift. Just the holy weight of two lives that had collided in silence long before this night. Then, after what felt like minutes suspended in reverence, he leaned forward. Not as a host, not even as a friend, but as someone who had once waited in the dark himself. His voice came low, threaded with something deeper than empathy, something that had been earned through fire. Let me ask you something, he said gently, almost as if afraid the wrong words might reopen everything she'd just managed to close. Have you ever heard God in silence? Jasmine didn't answer at first. Her eyes lowered, but not to escape the question, only to search for it. The kind of search that doesn't begin in the head, but in the chest, where old pain never quite forgets how to echo. Her hands rested still, but her breath caught as if the question had pulled loose a memory buried too deeply for casual telling. When she looked up again, there was no defiance, no political fire, just something almost childlike in its naked truth. Yes, she said finally, and her voice had changed. Lower, slower. I have. Her lips parted again, but the words didn't come right away. They had to travel through something first. But it wasn't the kind of silence people think of when they pray. It wasn't soft. It wasn't sacred. It was hollow, deafening. The air in the studio thickened, not with tension, but with awe. I sat in that kitchen, she said, and I remember thinking, so this is what the end sounds like. Not a scream, not a cry, just nothing. Just silence so loud it presses on your chest until it steals your name. Her fingers curled slightly into the fabric of her skirt. And in that moment, I wasn't reaching for God. I wasn't calling out. I didn't have the strength. Her eyes flickered toward Steve again. I didn't even think he was watching. She let out a breath that seemed to rattle loose from her ribs. And then the screen lit up. There was no need to say whose voice was on that screen. Everyone in the room already knew. It wasn't dramatic, she continued. No angelic choir, no thunder, just a tired video on my cracked phone. Your voice, grainy, low, real. Her words began to tremble, not from performance, but from the weight of memory becoming sound again. You said, if you're at the bottom of your life, don't jump. Just stay still. Maybe that's not a grave. Maybe it's the foundation God is laying to lift you up. A shudder ran through her shoulders. And Steve, that sentence broke through something I didn't even know had solidified around my heart. She paused, her hands now covering her sternum, not for drama, but because the ache had returned, and this time she wasn't pushing it away. I didn't hear a voice from heaven. I heard yours. I didn't feel a miracle. I felt presence. She nodded slowly, as if confirming it to herself, even as she said it aloud. And for the first time in weeks, the silence wasn't my enemy. It was the place where I realized God hadn't abandoned me. He was just waiting for me to be still long enough to hear something different. Her eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. I'd spent my whole life speaking for others, fighting, defending, shouting. But that night, for the first time, I heard something speak for me. Steve didn't move, didn't shift. His crucifix glinted once more beneath the lights, but he made no attempt to reach for it. Instead, he simply listened the way the broken always do, without blinking. Sometimes, Jasmine whispered, God doesn't shout over the storm. He just sits with you in the wreckage until you can breathe again. A breath. And sometimes, he uses people who don't know they're being used. Her voice sharpened, like steel emerging from soft cloth. You weren't preaching, Steve. You weren't trying to save anyone. But that is what made it holy. Because grace that isn't performed is the only kind that truly heals. Then came the sentence that didn't rise in volume, but in force. An emotional crescendo hidden inside a whisper. That night I realized, God is never late. He just shows up in ways we're too wounded to expect. And with those final words, the studio didn't erupt. It held still, held breath, held space. Because in that moment, two people understood something that cameras could never capture. God doesn't always speak through prophets. Sometimes he speaks through the wounded. And sometimes the voice that saves you doesn't even know you're listening. And as the last word left Jasmine's lips, God just shows up in ways we're too wounded to expect. The air in the studio became sacred. Not silent, sacred. The kind of stillness not born from absence, but from awe. No one clapped. No one moved. The camera operators behind the lenses weren't technicians anymore. They were witnesses. And in the center of that quiet battlefield of truth and breath, Steve Harvey sat still as stone, staring into Jasmine's eyes with something between reverence and ruin. The crucifix on his chest, once just a detail, now glinted like a burden newly understood. His face, once trained to balance gravity with levity, was undone. Not performative, not stylized, but raw, like someone remembering a prayer they didn't know they'd said. His hand slowly moved toward his chest again, almost involuntarily, and closed around the small silver cross. But this time it wasn't instinct, it was recognition. Recognition of the fact that something he said, once casually, unscripted, had echoed in the heart of someone sitting on the edge of ending everything. Jasmine had just told him that his words, spoken without knowing their destination, had reached into a night soaked in despair and whispered, "Not yet." His fingers curled tighter around the cross. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't try to respond. His breath stalled somewhere between his lungs and his throat, like his soul had frozen mid-exhale. Then quietly, like he was afraid to break something sacred between them, he said, "I was just trying to tell the truth that night." A pause. "I didn't think anyone would remember it." He swallowed hard, lips parting again. "I sure didn't think someone would be holding on to it like that." His eyes shimmered. "I wasn't trying to be anything." Jasmine heard the sentence falter, and in that moment, she understood something with crystalline clarity. The very man who had saved her didn't believe he had the right to be called a savior. She reached out, not impulsively, but with the slow gravity of someone handing something sacred. Her hand moved across the space between their chairs and landed gently, purposefully, on Steve's. He didn't pull away. He didn't flinch. He looked down at their joined hands like a truth he had never asked for had just landed in his palm. She let her hand close around his, not as a gesture of comfort, but as confirmation. The contact wasn't warm, it was electric. Something eternal moved through the moment, slow and pulsing, like grace had decided to manifest in skin and trembling fingers. Then Jasmine spoke, not to the room, not to the audience, not to the world, just to him. "You think you're just a storyteller," she said, voice low but charged like thunder beneath velvet. "But you're not." Her grip tightened, just slightly, anchoring him to the truth he had refused to claim. "You're a messenger, a vessel, a man who plants faith without needing a steeple or a robe or a pulpit." She leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. "You've been preaching to the broken without ever wearing the title, and you don't even know you've been walking in ministry your whole life." Steve's lips quivered. His jaw clenched as he tried, desperately, to hold himself together. But it was too late. The wall cracked, then shattered. His shoulders trembled, just once, and a single tear slid down the side of his face. Still, he didn't let go of her hand. If anything, his fingers closed tighter around hers like someone grabbing the ledge before falling. "I never thought I was good enough for that," he said, voice fractured. "I mean, I've done some things, Jasmine. I've failed big. I've fallen hard. I've doubted loud. I've walked away from God more times than I can count." He blinked rapidly, trying to control what no longer could be contained. "I've cursed the heavens. I've begged for answers that never came. I've questioned everything." His voice cracked. "So I figured if God ever needed someone to do something holy, he'd pick someone who wasn't so dented." The vulnerability was so raw it hurt to witness. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She leaned closer. Her eyes didn't soften. They sharpened. Not in judgment, but in conviction. And when she spoke again, it came like the voice of fire in a burning bush. Not loud, but inescapably true. "That's exactly why he chose you," she said. The sentence landed like prophecy, vibrating in the silence around them. "Because you didn't try to look the part. Because you weren't rehearsed. Because your flaws made room for other people to feel human again." She pulled her hand back, just slightly, then laid it over her own heart. "Steve, we live in a world that worships polish, platforms, perfection. But God doesn't use perfection. He uses pain." She let the words breathe. "And he doesn't trust the ones who chase titles. He trusts the ones who carry scars." Steve's eyes widened, tears spilling freely now. Jasmine nodded as if sealing something invisible between them. "You didn't save me because you were trying to. You saved me because you weren't." Her voice broke, just a hair, and that made it even more dangerous. "That night, you weren't on a mission. You weren't following a script. You were just speaking from a place you thought no one would hear. But I did." She paused, and when she spoke again, it was with the authority of someone who had earned every syllable. "And that unintentional truth, that unrehearsed honesty, is why I'm alive." She let go of his hand then, not because the moment had passed, but because what needed to be given had already been delivered. Steve slowly leaned back, wiping a hand across his face, breathing like someone who had just escaped drowning without knowing they were underwater. He looked at her, not with disbelief, but with something quieter, something holy, something like surrender. A moment passed, then another, and finally Steve whispered the question, not to break the silence, but to honor it. "Why me?" It wasn't rhetorical, it wasn't dramatic. It was the quiet scream of a man who had just realized he had been walking with purpose on a road he thought was random. Jasmine didn't hesitate. She leaned forward once more, her voice gentler now, but no less lethal. "Because you never claimed the spotlight," she said. "Because you made space for someone like me to hear God in the static. Because when no one else came, your voice did. She placed her hand back over her chest, over the place where her grief once drowned her. You didn't know it. You weren't aiming, but you reached me. A pause. And Steve, maybe that's the most divine thing of all, being used without knowing it. He said nothing. He couldn't. He simply looked at her as a man who had spent his life telling jokes, giving advice, offering encouragement. Now seeing, finally seeing, that somewhere along the way, those words had been doing more than landing. They had been lifting. And Jasmine, still steady, still rooted, gave him the only truth that mattered now. Steve, she said softly, you thought you were just telling stories, but to someone barely holding on, you were speaking life. And in the heavy, aching stillness that followed, Steve Harvey, man of comedy, of culture, of cameras, closed his eyes, bowed his head, and let the revelation settle over him like rain on dry ground. He had never called himself a preacher, but heaven had. And as Jasmine's voice dissolved into the silence she had so powerfully claimed, you were speaking life. A shift occurred. Not on stage, not in the script, but in the spirit of everyone present. The atmosphere no longer felt like a studio. It felt like a sanctuary, the kind of place where words weren't just heard, they were received, where pain became currency and testimony became a sacred exchange. The spotlights overhead seemed to retreat, not in brightness, but in reverence. Like even the equipment knew this wasn't performance anymore. This was something closer to revelation. Jasmine sat for just a moment longer, her hands resting in her lap, the very posture of a woman who had bled her truth into the open and now had nothing left to conceal. Her breathing was slow, purposeful, as if she were grounding herself in the weight of everything she had finally released. Then, without ceremony, without even the faintest tremble of hesitation, she stood, and the world stood with her. The audience didn't move, but somehow their stillness rose with her, as though every person in the room had just watched someone walk out of their own grave. Her heels tapped gently against the stage as she turned to face Steve, who was still seated, head bowed, hand gripping the cross on his chest like a man anchoring himself to something he only now understood had been keeping him afloat all along. He wasn't wiping his tears. He wasn't performing resolve. He was processing. And not the surface kind of processing that happens in interviews when someone needs a beat to think of a witty line. No, this was soul-deep, marrow-level awakening. Then Steve slowly, deliberately rose to his feet. But he didn't rise like a celebrity returning to the show. He rose like a man standing at an altar. His knees weren't weak, but they carried the weight of understanding. Understanding that something had just happened that could not be undone, unseen, or unfelt. He looked at Jasmine, and in his eyes was the expression of a man who had finally met the consequence of his own obedience. The obedience of speaking one sentence on one stage on one night, and learning that sentence had kept someone from stepping into forever. The studio was silent, not empty, not quiet, sacred. Even the cameras seemed unsure whether they should keep rolling, as if the technology was too modern, too crude to capture what now lived between them. Jasmine faced Steve fully. The air between them felt electric, but not tense. Charged. Charged with everything that had been spoken, everything that had been carried, everything that had finally been seen. Her voice came again, but this time it didn't need strength to command. It had earned authority through vulnerability. She spoke with the voice of a woman who had carried a coffin in her chest for years, and now finally was lowering it into the ground. Steve, she said, and even the way she said his name was a benediction. You thought you were just telling stories. Her words didn't fall. They landed, solid, undeniable. But to someone sitting alone, drowning in silence, you were speaking life. He blinked, lips parted slightly, but still unable to respond. His eyes shimmered, not from emotion he was trying to hide, but from emotion he finally had permission to feel. Jasmine took a step closer, not for drama, not for attention, just enough to close the distance of a revelation. You taught me something I never read in law school. Never heard in church. Never found in any speech I ever gave, she continued. You taught me that sometimes salvation doesn't come from scripture. It doesn't arrive in thunder. It doesn't wear robes or stand behind podiums. She took one more step, and now they stood face to face. No politics, no television, just one saved soul and one man who didn't know he was a savior. Sometimes, she said, her voice trembling with the beauty of its own truth, salvation comes from a real person, a man who never asked to be holy, a man just trying to live right. Speak truth. Hold on. Wake up one more day. Her hands, slow and steady, lifted between them, hovering for a second in the space between his chest and hers. And then she touched his heart, not roughly, not theatrically, just placed her palm over his chest, right above the crucifix he had clutched all evening. Her hand wasn't a gesture. It was a recognition. You don't need a church to carry the word, she whispered. Steve's eyes closed, not to retreat, but to let the weight of it all settle in his bones. Tears spilled freely down his cheeks now, not born of sadness, but of knowing. Knowing that he had been entrusted with something divine without ever being told. Knowing that he had been a vessel, a lifeline, a whisper from God on a night when someone else had been begging for silence to end them. He opened his mouth, but only one sound came out, a single broken breath. It was Jasmine who filled the air again. But you know what moved me most? She asked, pulling her hand back, voice steadier now. It wasn't what you said. It was that you didn't even know you were saving someone. That's why it hit so hard. That's why it reached me. She stepped back, just half a pace, but enough to let the final words live in their own gravity. Because you weren't trying to be the light, and that's what made you shine. Steve looked at her, fully looked, and when he finally nodded, slow and tear-soaked, he said nothing. Not because he had nothing to offer, but because sometimes surrender is louder than any sentence. And as that nod hung in the air, the audience, who had remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, still didn't move, because they knew what they had witnessed was not entertainment. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't rehearsed. It was a miracle in plain clothes. Jasmine exhaled slowly, her chest rising with a peace that had been years in the making. She looked at Steve one last time, eyes no longer heavy with memory, but glowing with clarity. You reminded me, she said, her voice softer than ever, but no less commanding, that faith doesn't always look like a sermon. Her hands returned to her sides. Sometimes it looks like a man, she finished, just doing his best, and doing it loud enough for God to slip through the cracks. And Steve, his body trembling, his soul wide open, didn't answer. He simply stood there, tears falling, heart open, finally understanding what it meant to sow something divine, without ever knowing he was the sower. And as the final tear slid down Steve's cheek, and Jasmine's voice faded into a silence louder than applause, one truth remained suspended in the room like smoke from a long-burning fire. This moment wasn't just about two lives intersecting. It was about something deeper, what it means to matter in a world that forgets people every single day. The lesson didn't come wrapped in applause. It came wrapped in scars. Scars that Jasmine carried not on her skin, but in her voice, in the way it trembled and held firm all at once. You could see it in her eyes. The exhaustion of being called strong just because she survived what should have killed her spirit. You could feel it in her breath, the ache of fighting battles she never started but was born into. The world doesn't hand out medals to women like her. It hands out microphones, and then cuts the feed when she speaks too loud. It offers seats at the table, then moves the table when she arrives. And yet she showed up, again, and again, and again. Not because she was invincible, but because she knew someone had to speak when the world turned its back. That's the thing about injustice. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers behind closed doors. Sometimes it stamps denied on a piece of paper with no explanation. Sometimes it looks like a committee adjourning just before your bill is heard. Sometimes it sounds like your name being mispronounced in rooms where everyone knows exactly who you are. Jasmine didn't become a fighter because she wanted to. She became one because silence was lethal. Because if she didn't name what was killing her people, the system would keep burying them without ever writing it down. But that night with Steve Harvey taught her something else, something more dangerous, more sacred. That sometimes it's not the power in the pulpit, the vote in the chamber, or the protest in the street that saves lives. Sometimes it's a single sentence, said by someone who didn't know they were being watched, by someone who wasn't trying to lead, just trying to live right. And in that revelation came the most human lesson of all. You never know when your ordinary might be someone else's miracle. Jasmine had faced bullets in the form of words. You're too emotional. You're a race baiter. You're making this political. She'd been reduced to headlines and hate mail, turned into a symbol people could attack without ever learning her story. But Steve, he reminded her, no, proved to her that humanity was still possible, that somewhere beneath the algorithms and debates, someone could still speak truth without needing a platform, a party, or permission. And that's the paradox of faith and survival. The people who've been broken the most often carry the healing. That video Steve had recorded, it wasn't a sermon, it wasn't polished. The mic crackled, the camera shook. He stumbled over a line. And yet, it reached her more deeply than any law ever had. Why? Because it was real. Because it wasn't trying to convince, it was just trying to tell the truth. And in a world addicted to noise, to spectacle, to control, that kind of truth is revolutionary. Jasmine realized, standing there beside him, that we've forgotten what power actually looks like. It's not always in the suit. It's not in the viral clip. It's not in the crowd. Sometimes it's in the whisper someone hears in their loneliest hour and never forgets. Sometimes it's in a stranger's voice saying, don't give up. And not for likes, not for clout, just because it's right. That is what makes the lesson unforgettable. We are responsible for one another in ways we may never see. The cashier who smiles when no one else does, the teacher who stays behind after class, the father who says, I'm proud of you, and doesn't realize that sentence will carry a child for 10 more years. The host who speaks from his gut just once and saves a congresswoman he's never met. It's not about being perfect. It's about being present. And Jasmine had spent so long trying to be perfect, measured, articulate, unshakable, that she forgot. The presence of someone who speaks truth from the gut, that is what liberates people. So when she looked at Steve that night, tears in both their eyes, she didn't see a man who had stumbled into greatness. She saw a man who had been trusted with it. And that leads to the deeper injustice the world never warns you about. The system doesn't just rob the voiceless, it also robs the unknowing heroes. People like Steve, who've been led to believe they're just entertainers, just employees, just ordinary. But Jasmine knew better. He was a living reminder that divine assignments don't come with business cards. The world had taught Jasmine to see salvation as something institutional, legislative, historical. She thought justice would come from courtrooms and cameras. But on the night she almost ended it all, the Constitution didn't save her. The Bible didn't leap from the shelf. The phone didn't ring. A grainy video with Steve Harvey's voice did. And the lesson was brutal and beautiful. You don't have to be famous to be holy. You just have to show up, speak truth, and not look away. Jasmine had seen the ugliest parts of America, the part that punishes you for surviving, the part that applauds your pain but doesn't change the policies that caused it. She had seen how the powerful build walls and dare you to call them gates. And she had watched her sister be buried without justice, her name dragged in hearings where her life was summarized in a sentence. But this lesson, this human lesson, was different. It didn't scream. It didn't punish. It held her. Steve Harvey didn't mean to be a preacher that night. He meant to be honest. And honesty, in a world full of spin, is prophetic. So here it was. The thing Jasmine had fought through blood and breath to name. Salvation isn't distant. It's among us. Worn in flesh, spoken in passing, lived by people who don't even know they're lighting the path for someone else. And if Steve Harvey could do that for her, just by being real, then maybe, just maybe, the rest of us could do it too. Not with a sermon, not with a stage, but with presence, with courage, with a sentence said at the right time to the right soul. Because the truth is, we're all walking past people who are barely holding on. And every time we speak life, every time we choose kindness over convenience, every time we tell someone, you matter, even when they don't believe it themselves, we plant something holy, and long after we forget the moment, someone else might still be alive because of it. And so, as the dust settled, not in the studio, but in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed this collision of survival and grace, Jasmine knew she couldn't stop at testimony, because truth without movement is just a whisper waiting to die. So she stepped forward, not as a congresswoman, not as a survivor, but as a mirror, held up to a nation too comfortable with forgetting. Her voice, already etched with the tremble of memory, now rang with something sharper. Urgency. The kind that doesn't ask for your attention. It demands it. And when she spoke again, it wasn't just to Steve. It wasn't even to the studio audience. It was to every person watching, whether from a living room couch, a hospital bed, or a prison bunk they didn't deserve to be in. You heard my story, she said, but this ain't just mine. Her eyes scanned the room like searchlights looking for survivors. This is the story of the kid who gets up early to take 2 buses to a school with no heat, the mother working 3 jobs and still can't afford insulin for her son, the man with a felony from 20 years ago who still can't vote in a democracy he pays taxes to. Her voice rose not with anger, but with the rhythm of righteous fire. You want to know what injustice really looks like? It looks like calling people lazy when they're dying just trying to survive. It looks like praising resilience in communities you refuse to invest in. It looks like asking, why are they so angry? Instead of asking, why are they still being shot at, silenced, evicted, ignored? The air in the studio thickened, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She took one sharp step forward, her heels striking the floor like a gavel. But here's the thing, we are not powerless. There was no applause, just electricity. We're told change is slow, that it takes time, that it's complicated. She leaned in, her tone cutting through the fog of complacency. But the truth is, change is deliberate. It's made. It's carved. It's forced into the world by people who refuse to sit still while others suffer. She raised her hand, not for drama, but to signal something sacred. So I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me. I'm not asking you to admire me. I'm asking you to join me. The crowd still didn't move, but their silence was no longer passive. It was readying itself. You've got a voice? Use it. You've got a platform? Risk it. You've got privilege? Leverage it. Then she paused because what came next wasn't just from her mind. It was from the part of her spirit that had walked through hell and come back louder. And if you feel like you've got nothing, if you feel invisible, if the world has told you you're too poor, too broken, too late, listen to me. Her hand now pressed to her own heart. You are exactly who this world needs. A murmur began to stir, low, quiet, like an orchestra tuning before a thunderclap. Because real change doesn't come from the top down, she said. It comes from the ground up, from the unheard, the unseen, the ones who weren't supposed to survive, but did. And now we stand with something the powerful fear more than protest. Her eyes locked with the camera, as if burning through the screen. We stand with truth. And when truth finds its voice, systems tremble. At that moment, Steve was silent, not out of awe, but out of alignment. He didn't move, didn't blink, because he knew, like everyone else in that room, this wasn't a speech, this was a summons. Jasmine took one final step toward center stage, toward the light, not to bask in it, but to bend it toward those still standing in the dark. Don't wait for the perfect moment, she said. Don't wait for someone to tell you you're qualified. Don't wait until it's easy or safe or popular. Now her voice broke, not in weakness, but from the weight of what had to be said. If I had waited for that, I wouldn't be standing here. I wouldn't be here. Silence again, holy, taut, reverent. Then she dropped her hand, letting the weight of her words do the final work. This isn't just a show. This isn't just a moment. This is a call. And you, every single one of you, has a role to play in answering it. The silence cracked open, not with applause, but with conviction. The kind that doesn't fade when the lights go down. The kind that lingers in your chest like a ticking clock, asking, what are you going to do now that you've heard the truth? Because this is no longer just Jasmine Crockett's fight. It's yours. It's ours. And it starts the moment you decide, I will not watch injustice and remain comfortable. I will not hear pain and remain quiet. I will not feel fear and remain still. It starts when you believe that small actions, truth spoken in private, courage shown in chaos, mercy offered in motion, can turn ordinary people into holy disruption. So wherever you are, stand up, speak louder, fight harder, hold someone, forgive yourself. Don't wait for the world to approve. Be the sentence someone else survives on. Just like Steve was, just like Jasmine became, just like you can be. Right now, right here, before the silence takes someone else. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a high-stakes Senate hearing watched by over 12 million Americans, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stands face-to-face with Senator Cory Booker, who launches a blistering attack, accusing her of corruption and partisanship. But with unwavering poise, Jasmine remains calm, allowing Booker's accusations to build, until, with surgical precision, she strikes back. In one devastating moment, she exposes Booker's own dubious donations and political maneuvering, shattering his moral high ground. Will this be the end of Booker's career, or has Jasmine just rewritten the rules of political power forever? Under the stark lighting of the Capitol hearing room, the air was thick with tension. It was early, yet every seat was filled, every lens aimed. Reporters murmured, staffers traded glances. This wasn't just a hearing, it was a staged confrontation. In the center sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, still as stone, her leather folder resting quietly in front of her. No fidgeting, no nerves, just controlled breath and sharp eyes that scanned the room without a flicker of fear. Across from her, Senator Cory Booker leaned forward, confident, rehearsed, ready to strike. To him, Crockett wasn't just a witness. She was a political opponent to be dismantled. Live. Booker radiated certainty, bolstered by party allies and press buzz. Crockett, by contrast, had no safety net. Just her voice, her facts, and that unreadable folder. But there was something off about how calm she looked, like she wasn't surprised to be under attack. Like she'd read this script before, the power imbalance was clear. He had the spotlight, she had the crosshairs. And yet it was her silence that unsettled the room. The question lingered in the air, unspoken but sharp. Had Jasmine Crockett walked into a trap, or come prepared to spring one? Emotions tightened like a noose as the silence broke. Not with Jasmine's voice, but with the calculated precision of a man who had rehearsed his strike. Senator Cory Booker leaned into the microphone before Jasmine could complete her introduction. His tone was silk over steel, measured, polished, but unmistakably loaded. Mr. Chairman, he began, pausing just long enough for the room to quiet. Before we proceed, I believe it's necessary to acknowledge a concern regarding the objectivity of our witness. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. In just a few words, he threw shade across the table, casting Jasmine not as an expert, but as a partisan operative in disguise. Ms. Crockett has a well-documented history of political activism, including appearances at rallies and commentary that aligns closely with one side of the aisle. That raises serious questions about the neutrality of the data she's here to present. He smiled faintly, turning toward the cameras, not her, as if the real audience wasn't in the room but at home, watching the clip he'd just manufactured for them. It was a subtle assassination of credibility, not meant to draw blood in the room, but to seed doubt across 1,000 screens. There was no objection, no gavel, just the shifting of weight across leather chairs and the low hum of approval from his allies. A few Democratic aides exchanged knowing looks, their expressions smug, already half composing the tweet. Booker holds Crockett accountable? One even nudged another, eyes on the live viewfinder. nodding with satisfaction as the camera zoomed in on Jasmine's unreadable face. Across the aisle, Republican senators frowned, their arms crossed, the tension in their brows saying what decorum wouldn't let them speak aloud. They recognized the tactic, a surgical political ambush cloaked in procedural language. Jasmine had said nothing controversial. She had not raised her voice. Yet already she'd been branded. Her integrity, impugned before her evidence, even left the folder resting at her fingertips. It wasn't just disrespect. It was design. Booker had planned this interruption not to extract truth, but to provoke reaction. Not to debate ideas, but to bait a misstep. Because a sharp retort, a flustered look, even a slight hesitation would be enough to confirm the narrative he was constructing. Unhinged, biased, unreliable. And he knew, better than most, that in politics, optics can bury substance. This wasn't cross-examination. It was character demolition, dressed up in Senate decorum. And the most damning part? It worked precisely because it wasn't overt. There was no slur, no shouted insult, just the quiet, elegant implication that Jasmine didn't belong here. Not because of her data, but because of who she was, where she had stood, and what she had once said. Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She didn't look down, didn't break eye contact, didn't shift in her seat. But inside that stillness was the crushing weight of a truth too old to name out loud. That she would always be judged by a different scale. That a man like Booker, once praised for his own activism, could now use hers as ammunition, and no one in power would call it what it was. Not unfair, not discriminatory, just politics. But Jasmine knew better. What she faced wasn't scrutiny, it was choreography. A performance engineered to strip her credibility without ever raising a voice. And at that moment, the question stopped being whether she would recover from this ambush. It became something deeper, something darker. How many times had she faced this same trial, behind different microphones, under different lights? And how many more were still to come? She hadn't said a word in her own defense, but the hearing already felt like a trial. And now Senator Booker was about to push things even further. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His words came slowly, calmly, almost like he was regretting having to say them, though he clearly didn't. "Mr. Chairman," he said, "I think we need to be honest about something. Some of the organizations connected to Congresswoman Crockett's research have been involved in efforts to challenge the results of certified elections." He didn't accuse her directly. He didn't say she led those efforts. But the meaning was clear. She was tied to people who tried to undo elections. That idea hung in the air like smoke. "I'm not saying she acted in bad faith," Booker added, "but for the sake of this committee's credibility, we should question whether her testimony is truly unbiased." With that, he leaned back in his chair, satisfied. He had done what he came to do, put doubt in the air without having to prove anything. The room didn't explode, it tightened. Quietly, a few staffers stopped taking notes. One aide whispered to another with a look that said, "This just got serious." No one called out what Booker had done, but everyone felt it. This wasn't just a debate about research anymore. He had tied Jasmine to something dangerous, something that questioned her loyalty to the democratic process itself. He didn't need proof. Just the hint of it was enough, and nobody stopped him. No one asked for sources. No one said, "That's too far." Because in politics, it's not always about truth. It's about perception. And now the perception was this. Jasmine Crockett might be part of something untrustworthy. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't frown or blink. Her hands stayed folded on the closed folder in front of her. But behind that stillness was something powerful. This was not the first time she had faced this kind of treatment, where her work, her background, her very presence were treated like a threat. Booker didn't attack her directly. He didn't have to. By connecting her name to controversy, he made the public question everything else she might say. It was quiet, polite, and devastating. And what made it worse? The silence that followed. Not from her. That silence was strength, but from the others. No one stood up for her. No one pushed back. No one even asked Booker to explain. The moment passed like a verdict, unspoken but felt. Still, Jasmine sat tall. She didn't rush to defend herself. She didn't fall into the trap, because she knew if she responded too fast, too emotionally, they'd say she was overreacting. So she waited, and in that moment, her silence said more than any speech could. I see what you're doing, and I won't let you control this moment. The air was thick with tension, Booker's words still hanging in the room, but Jasmine Crockett's silence was louder than anything he could say. Booker, caught in the fervor of his own rhetoric, had unleashed a barrage of accusations. His voice filled the space with the sharp edges of insinuation and implication, each sentence carefully constructed to undermine Jasmine's character. He had no need to prove her guilt. He was relying on the power of suggestion, painting her as a partisan, a player in a larger, nefarious game. His words dripped with confidence, even as they spiraled into an increasingly personal attack. The Democratic side of the room seemed to nod in approval, their subtle expressions of agreement punctuating his every word. The spotlight was on Booker, his momentum unstoppable. The room was with him. And Jasmine? Jasmine didn't move. Her eyes never left Booker, but she was calm, eerily calm. The contrast was jarring. Where Booker's energy surged, hers was still, a rock in the middle of a storm. She didn't respond to his accusations, didn't show the faintest sign of cracking under pressure. It wasn't indifference, it was discipline. She had been through this before, and yet every second of silence, every second that passed without her speaking, was more unnerving than anything Booker could say. And then, without warning, her hand began to move. A slow, deliberate gesture, like the quiet pulling of a trigger. She reached for her leather folder. The sound of the folder opening was barely perceptible in the midst of Booker's voice. But that was the moment. Everyone felt it. A shift. A pause in the tension. Booker's words, though still rolling off his tongue, suddenly seemed distant. The intensity in the room, which had been building around Booker, now started to coalesce around her. The focus for just a heartbeat was on Jasmine, not because she had spoken, but because she hadn't. She lifted her water glass with a delicate precision, setting it down with a soft, deliberate click, like the ticking of a clock in a room suddenly too quiet. As Booker continued his onslaught, his words becoming more fervent, Jasmine glanced at him, not in anger, but with the kind of look that felt like it could strip away every piece of armor he had built around his argument. It wasn't a glare, but it was filled with a calmness so intense it almost felt like a challenge. She wasn't rattled. She wasn't defensive. She was waiting, and as the camera caught the briefest flicker of that gaze, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. The air was electric, charged with the expectation that something profound was about to happen. For a brief moment, it felt like everything stopped. Booker, too caught up in his own rhythm, hadn't realized it yet, but the audience, the people watching, felt it. This wasn't a retreat. This wasn't surrender. Jasmine Crockett was biding her time, and the silence between them spoke louder than any words Booker had thrown her way. That quiet power, that unshakable poise, it made him seem small. It made his rhetoric seem hollow. The stage had shifted. Jasmine wasn't just a witness anymore. She had become the force that would decide the course of this hearing. And still the silence stretched. The room, the cameras, the viewers, they all knew something was about to break. What would she do next? Would she crush his narrative with evidence? Or would this silence, this powerful, purposeful silence, do the talking for her? The tension in the room, thick and suffocating, had reached a breaking point. But Jasmine Crockett's silence, so carefully maintained, was about to snap the razor-thin thread that held the room together. Booker's words had echoed through the space, like a drum beat, growing louder and more intense with each passing second. His accusations, thinly veiled as questions, had set the stage for what seemed like a public dissection of her character. The audience, the cameras, the aides in the room were all locked in on him, eagerly awaiting the final nail in Jasmine's political coffin. He had come with one goal: to reduce her to a partisan voice, to discredit her before she ever had a chance to speak. He had his moment, he had landed his blows. But what he hadn't anticipated was the quiet strength of the woman sitting across from him. And then, just as the room seemed to hold its breath in anticipation, Jasmine broke her silence, but not in the way anyone expected. She didn't respond with anger, with raised fists or accusations of her own. No, her words were measured, deliberate, calm, almost too calm. There was no fire in her voice, but the coolness of her question struck harder than any emotional retort could have. Senator Booker, she began, her voice unwavering, are you familiar with a donation made to your senatorial campaign on March 12th, 2019, in the amount of $10,000? The words seemed to hang in the air for a beat too long. For a brief second, the room fell into a stunned silence, as though the question itself had an immense weight attached to it. Jasmine didn't look down at her notes, didn't shift in her seat. She simply asked, calmly, without hesitation, like she had all the time in the world. The question wasn't shouted, wasn't rushed. It was a carefully placed bomb, its fuse burning with quiet intensity. And with it, Jasmine shifted the entire room's focus. All eyes turned to Booker as the unspoken accusation of conflict of interest began to swirl in the air. Booker, who had been riding the momentum of his assault, faltered. It was a small moment, but in it, everything changed. The confidence he had worn so easily began to crack. Just slightly at first, then a little more. He fumbled for words. I have many donors, Miss Crockett, he said, his voice losing its earlier conviction. He seemed to be grasping for something solid to hold on to, but nothing he said could undo the sudden discomfort in his posture. I follow all proper disclosure procedures, he added, almost as though he were trying to convince himself more than anyone else in the room. The audience, the staffers, the cameras, they were all watching, waiting for the next move. Jasmine's question had shifted the atmosphere in the room from one of aggressive certainty to doubt. Booker, for the first time, was not the one leading the charge. He was on the defensive, his carefully constructed narrative of righteousness and transparency now unraveling in real time. Jasmine's composure, her stillness, was in stark contrast to the growing unease in Booker's body language. She didn't need to shout or accuse. The question alone, quiet, pointed, was enough. Booker's hesitation, the faint crack in his previously impenetrable confidence, spoke volumes. He didn't know how to answer her question. The transparency he had built around himself was now under scrutiny, and in that silence, in the absence of Booker's typical fiery rhetoric, Jasmine had shifted the power dynamic entirely. What had started as an all-out attack against her was now an investigation into his own actions, and no one in the room had missed the change. In that crucial moment, the hearing room shifted as Jasmine Crockett, once the target of the attack, became the one holding the reins of power. The calculated silence following her question about the donation was broken only by the rustle of paper as Jasmine moved into the next phase of her strategy. There was no rush, no sense of urgency in her movements, just the controlled precision of someone who had long known what needed to be done. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to fill the room with emotional outbursts. Jasmine's quiet confidence was more powerful than any grand speech could be. She had waited for this moment, and now it was her turn to speak the truth. Her hand slid into the leather folder once more, pulling out 3 neatly organized documents, each one carefully placed in front of her like the pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, would expose the man sitting across from her. She began with the first document, laying it out for all to see. A $15,000 donation from a tech company with a long history of opposing regulations that could harm its profits. Then, without skipping a beat, she turned to the second. A $7,000 contribution from a real estate mogul whose development projects had been at the center of zoning and tax disputes, projects that had mysteriously been approved shortly after the donation. The third donation was perhaps the most damning, a $12,000 transfer from a pharmaceutical lobbying group just weeks before Booker had sponsored legislation that benefited the industry. With each figure, Jasmine's words remained cool, unfazed. She did not flinch. She did not raise her voice to dramatize the point. She didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves, but what made the evidence even more striking was the timing. She slid a new set of documents across the table, email chains that showed Booker's aides discussing strategic donations to help advance their legislative agenda. followed by a series of memos linking those donations directly to decisions Booker had made on the Senate floor. Jasmine's delivery was methodical, as if this were not a revelation but a well-worn process. She was not surprised by the information. She had expected it, and now it was being laid bare for everyone in the room. Jasmine didn't need to say much. The documents themselves were enough. She handed the papers over to the committee clerk, who started distributing them. One by one, the senators flipped through the pages. Some squinted at the figures, others read through the emails, and all of them, without exception, knew what this meant. This wasn't just about policy anymore. This wasn't just a hearing about electoral integrity. This was about accountability, about a powerful senator whose public stance of righteousness now stood in direct contradiction to the private dealings exposed by these documents. The room was completely still. The murmurs that had once circulated about her character now seemed distant, irrelevant. Booker, once so assured in his attacks, had lost his composure. His earlier confidence had faded into a subtle unease, his eyes darting between the papers and the committee members. The weight of the evidence was too much to ignore. His previous attempts to paint her as unfit, untrustworthy, began to feel increasingly hollow, like a house of cards on the verge of collapsing. He stuttered. His words failed him. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone, even those who had initially sided with him, now questioned his integrity. Jasmine remained silent, but her silence was a statement in itself. She had asked her question. She had laid out the evidence. She had shifted the narrative. The power dynamic had completely reversed. In a room full of critics and rivals, it was now Jasmine who commanded attention, and Booker who was left fumbling to defend himself. The committee, once so ready to pick apart her every move, was now hesitant, uncertain. No one spoke. No one needed to. The truth had been presented, and for the first time that day, Jasmine was not the one on trial. She had become the one asking the questions. And in doing so, she had flipped the entire course of the hearing. The room hung in a suffocating silence, each moment stretching longer as Booker floundered, trying to regain the upper hand he had lost in the blink of an eye. The smooth cadence of his earlier speech, filled with sharp jabs and confident rhetoric, was nowhere to be found. Now there was a sharpness to his voice that was laced with uncertainty, like a man who had stepped too far, only to realize he had nowhere to stand. His face reddened, and his usual commanding presence faltered as he searched for words that would allow him to regain control. His earlier attack on Jasmine, so cleanly executed, now felt like an echo, distant and ineffective. The truth, the weight of the evidence she had just laid out, hung heavy in the room, suffocating the air. Jasmine's composed silence, so deliberate and poised, had torn apart the very foundation of his attack. Booker's attempt at recovery was weak. "This is a distraction," he blurted out, his words cracking as they left his mouth. His attempt at deflection sounded hollow, an empty defense that betrayed the panic rising beneath his calm exterior. The phrase came out too quickly, too desperately. It was a feeble grasp at a lifeline that wasn't there, and everyone in the room felt it. That one sentence, the awkward, strained plea, echoed far louder than any of his previous arguments. And as the cameras caught his moment of vulnerability, the words, "This is a distraction," became his undoing. The line, once spoken with misplaced confidence, would soon be twisted into something entirely different by the very medium that had once supported him. The clip, caught in real time, would spread like wildfire on the internet. It wasn't just a blunder. It was a moment that would haunt him for days, weeks, maybe longer. In the silence that followed, Jasmine did not react. She did not flinch. She did not look surprised by his stumble. She had anticipated this moment of weakness, and with the poise that had defined her throughout the hearing, she seized it. Her voice, when it came, was steady, too steady to be ignored. "I'm simply applying the same standard you set for me," she said, her words laced with quiet authority. There was no harshness, no spite, just the calm strength of someone who had been unjustly accused and was now finally allowed to speak the truth. She was not attacking him. She was reminding everyone in the room that the double standard they had allowed was now exposed. She had been subjected to intense scrutiny, accused of bias without evidence, and yet, when the tables were turned, Booker was the one who was unprepared, the one who had to resort to deflection. Her words struck a deeper chord than anyone in the room could have predicted. She wasn't just responding to Booker, she was addressing the very premise of the hearing itself. The very idea that her integrity could be questioned based on assumptions about her political leanings had been challenged, and now Booker stood exposed for the same behavior. Jasmine had not raised her voice. She had not made a scene. She had simply stated a fact. If Booker demanded a level of scrutiny for her, he should expect the same for himself. It wasn't an attack. It was a correction. And as the room processed the weight of her statement, the truth hung like a heavy fog. Booker, once the figurehead of moral outrage in the room, now found himself on the defensive. He had been so sure of his righteousness, so confident in his ability to control the narrative. But now the narrative had shifted. Jasmine's calm, composed response had turned the tide. Booker's words, once the weapon, were now the exposed weakness. The room that had once been filled with support for him now felt heavy with the shift in dynamics. The predator had become the prey, and the silent force of Jasmine's counterattack was undeniable. The room felt heavier than before, as though the weight of the words that had been spoken could no longer be ignored. The battle had shifted, and Booker was no longer the one controlling the narrative. Jasmine Crockett had just taken the reins. As Booker struggled to find his footing, unable to recover the momentum he once had, Jasmine felt the space open up before her. It wasn't about defending herself anymore. This moment was about clarity, about exposing the truth with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. She had been asked to justify her integrity, to prove that her every action and every decision had been transparent. But now it was Booker who needed to answer for the same scrutiny. Her voice cut through the tension in the room, calm but with an undeniable power that echoed in every corner. "Senator Booker, let's talk about transparency," she said, her words slow but steady. "Every single donation I've received, every dollar contributed to my campaign, has been publicly disclosed. There's no secret here. There's nothing hidden. My supporters, my backers, they are known to the public. There's nothing to question." She let the silence follow her statement, the weight of it sinking in. This was the truth. No corners were being cut, no backdoors involved. Jasmine Crockett had nothing to hide. She paused, watching Booker's eyes shift ever so slightly, the unease creeping in. It was subtle, but it was there. He was waiting for her to say more, but Jasmine wasn't done. This wasn't just about defending herself. This was about dismantling Booker's narrative. "Now let's discuss your situation," she continued, her tone unwavering. "I have never once sent a letter to a government department asking for favorable treatment after receiving a donation. Not once." She let her words linger, watching him as the truth of her statement began to take root. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. She spoke with quiet authority, a confidence that only comes when you know you're right. And then she landed the final blow. "But you, Senator Booker," she said, leaning forward slightly, "you've done just that. You received donations from organizations that have a direct financial interest in changes to federal policy. And after those donations, you wrote letters to the Treasury Department, pushing for changes in investigations that could benefit those same organizations." Her eyes never left his, and she didn't wait for his response. The room was already reacting, shifting in real time, feeling the weight of her words as they settled into the space between them. The silence that followed was profound. Booker's face tightened. He couldn't brush it off. There was no quick comeback, no offhand remark to dismiss it. The room could feel it. The moral high ground he had built so carefully had just crumbled in front of their eyes. The camera lingered on his face, capturing every moment of his discomfort. His mouth opened, but no words came. Jasmine had not attacked him. She had simply laid the facts before him, without fury, without aggression, and now he was forced to sit in them, unable to escape. Jasmine Crockett had drawn a line in the sand. She had shown the room and the world that the standards Booker had set for her were not universal. He too had made decisions based on donations, based on personal interests hidden behind a facade of moral outrage. And now the truth was clear. Jasmine's actions were out in the open, for all to see. while Booker had spent years cultivating an image of integrity, only to have it shattered in seconds. The stark contrast between the two of them could not have been more evident. She had lived her truth openly. He had built his career on a lie of moral superiority that was now exposed for what it truly was. The room was silent, and in that silence the truth was louder than anything that had been spoken before. The atmosphere in the room had become almost suffocating, the air thick with the echoes of Jasmine's calm but powerful revelations. Booker's earlier confidence, once towering over the room like a fortress, had crumbled in the face of truth. And now, with a single command, Chairman Durbin had brought the session to a halt. The sound of the gavel falling was like the final note of a symphony that had reached its crescendo. "We'll take a brief recess," Durbin's voice rang out, but the tension in the room was palpable. The recess was more than just a break. It was a moment of reckoning, a chance for the room to process what had just transpired. The committee members rose to their feet, their movements sluggish as though they too were trapped in the weight of the sudden shift in power. Booker, who had been so sure of his dominance, seemed to shrink under the gravity of what had just happened. His words, once delivered with the authority of someone in control, now echoed hollow in the ears of everyone present. As Booker turned and walked briskly toward the door, his face was a study in frustration and disbelief. His usual confident stride was replaced with hurried steps, as though he were trying to outrun the consequences of his own actions. He glanced back only once, his eyes momentarily meeting Jasmine's. But there was no defiance in that look, only the quiet understanding that he had been outmaneuvered. He muttered something to his assistant, his words swallowed by the murmur of the room, but his body language said it all. He was rattled. The facade he had carefully constructed over years of public service was now cracking, and he had no idea how to put the pieces back together. On the other hand, Jasmine Crockett remained seated at the table, her posture as unyielding as ever. She had not moved. She had not reacted. She had not allowed the chaos surrounding her to disturb the calm that had become her shield. As Booker rushed out, his mind undoubtedly racing to find a way to salvage his position, Jasmine simply sipped from her glass of water. The contrast between them couldn't have been more striking. She, the accused, was unshaken. He, the accuser, had been reduced to a man on the defensive, unsure of how to move forward. The power dynamic that had once favored Booker was now firmly in Jasmine's hands, but she wasn't gloating. She didn't need to. She had won, but her victory was quiet. It was measured. It was the kind of victory that came not from emotion, but from unwavering confidence in the truth. The room, once filled with murmurs of support for Booker, was now holding its collective breath. Jasmine's calmness in the face of everything thrown at her had unsettled the room in a way Booker's passionate speech had never been able to. She had not been broken by the injustice she had faced. She had not been shaken by the personal attacks. Instead, she had turned the tables with the quietest of gestures, the reveal of undeniable facts, the revelation of hypocrisy, and the mastery of self-control. While Booker had sought to make her the target, Jasmine had made him the subject of scrutiny, and in doing so, had shifted the entire balance of power. As Booker exited the room, his every movement was infused with the weight of his defeat. The doors closed behind him with a soft thud, but the echoes of his departure lingered, a symbol of his lost control. Jasmine, meanwhile, remained. The quiet strength she had exuded was now even more apparent. She had not raised her voice. She had not shouted him down. But she had done something more significant. She had exposed him, not through words but through truth. And in that quiet, deliberate stillness, she had secured her position, not just in the room, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who had witnessed this pivotal moment. The silence spoke volumes. Booker was defeated. Jasmine had emerged victorious. And with that, the power dynamics had been forever altered. The moment the recess ended, it was clear the dynamic in the room had shifted irrevocably. Booker walked back in, but his presence was no longer commanding. It was reluctant, hesitant, as though he were walking back into a situation he no longer controlled. The sounds of chairs scraping against the floor seemed to amplify in the silence that followed his return. It wasn't just the physical noise. It was the emotional weight, the sense that Booker had lost the upper hand. He stepped back into the hearing room with a strained composure, but it was clear to everyone that the storm he had stormed in with had long passed. The confidence that had once radiated from him had crumbled under the weight of Jasmine's calm and precise response. Booker sat back down at his table, adjusting his papers without looking at anyone. The same fire that had fueled his earlier speeches now seemed distant, reduced to nothing more than a flicker in his tired eyes. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated, as though his usual words no longer felt right. Finally, after a brief pause, he offered something so mundane, so technical, that it felt almost absurd. "Could you clarify the dates of these donations in the documents you've presented?" he asked, his voice hollow, almost detached. It was a far cry from the fiery rhetoric he had unleashed just moments ago, trying to paint Jasmine as untrustworthy, unqualified, and politically biased. The room felt smaller somehow, more oppressive. His question, so devoid of substance, lingered in the air like an afterthought. The Democratic side, which had once rallied behind his passionate accusations, now sat motionless. No one spoke, not a word of support, not a murmur of approval. They were all silent, their heads slightly lowered, as though they were unwilling to meet his gaze. They were no longer the cheerleaders to his narrative, but silent observers, unwilling to defend the man who had so confidently attacked an opponent and had now been reduced to a man scraping for any semblance of control. The contrast was staggering. Before, Booker had dominated the room, his every word met with nods and agreement from his colleagues. Now, even those who had once backed him seemed unwilling to even look at him. The silence wasn't just from his adversaries, it was from everyone. The Democratic side, once quick to back him, now felt distant, as though the words he had spoken had soured the atmosphere. They knew what had happened. They knew what had shifted in the course of the hearing. Jasmine Crockett had turned the tables, and Booker's once unshakable confidence had been reduced to an echo of its former self. Booker's eyes flitted across the room, never fully meeting anyone's gaze. His once steady posture had slumped ever so slightly, a small but significant shift that told the story of his mental and emotional decline. The camera zoomed in on his face, capturing the slight tension in his jaw, the furrow of his brow, the way his eyes darted nervously, unwilling to settle on one person for too long. There was no more fire in his gaze, no more certainty. His earlier conviction, the righteousness he had worn so proudly, had been stripped away by the weight of his own failure. His eyes, which had once been full of fire, were now full of something else. Doubt, discomfort, and perhaps for the first time in a long while, the realization that he had underestimated his opponent. Jasmine, on the other hand, remained steadfast, her posture unchanged, her face calm and unreadable. She had delivered her facts, and in doing so, had not only exposed the cracks in Booker's armor, but had forced him to confront his own hypocrisy. The room could feel the shift in energy. The Democratic side was no longer rallying behind Booker. Instead, they were watching him closely, their silence a quiet acknowledgement that they knew the truth had shifted. As Booker continued to fumble for his words, a deep sense of isolation seemed to descend upon him. He was no longer a leader in this room. He was a man whose narrative had collapsed under the weight of the evidence Jasmine had presented. His usual ability to command the room, to assert moral superiority, had been replaced by a hollow, desperate attempt to hold on to whatever dignity he could muster. But it was too late. The moment had passed. Jasmine had made sure of that. The camera zoomed in on Booker's face again, capturing the subtle but unmistakable shift in his expression. His eyes were no longer filled with conviction. Instead, they seemed tired, distant. His once bright gaze had dulled, replaced by something more vulnerable, something that hadn't been there before. He was no longer the man with the moral high ground. He was the man caught in a lie, trying to find a way out of it without drawing more attention to himself. It was a look that seemed almost pitiful, but it was more than that. It was a realization that in a single moment, he had been undone. The committee members who had been watching intently, some with eyes wide, others with furrowed brows, now exchanged glances. The power had shifted. It was no longer about the accusations Booker had leveled at Jasmine. It was about the undeniable truth that Jasmine had revealed. In her calm, unflinching defense, She had exposed the fragility of Booker's position, and no amount of technical questions or reassertions of his moral superiority could undo the damage she had done. Jasmine Crockett had taken control of the narrative, and Booker, once the self-assured prosecutor, had been reduced to nothing more than a man trying to regain some semblance of authority in a room that had already moved on. The hearing had ended, but the real fallout was just beginning. The moment Jasmine had turned the tables, exposing Booker's hypocrisy with chilling precision, rippled across every screen and every social media feed. As soon as the session concluded and cameras were packed away, the courtroom's energy didn't die down. It surged. Within minutes, a clip of Jasmine's devastating rebuttal was being shared across Twitter, Facebook, and every news outlet that could capture it. Her calm, controlled response to Booker's floundering attack had turned her from an underdog to a hero in the eyes of many. She had done what few others could do. She had taken the fight directly to Booker's doorstep and laid him bare for the world to see. The clip, which showed her methodically exposing Booker's own vulnerabilities, quickly went viral, capturing the imagination of millions. In just a few short hours, it was everywhere, pushed out in endless retweets, reshared by commentators, and picked up by newsrooms desperate to capitalize on the drama. But it wasn't just the content of the video that caused a stir. It was the sheer, undeniable power of what Jasmine had achieved. Her silence had been deafening. Her words had been surgical. She had outwitted a seasoned politician in real time, and that's what people were talking about. Media outlets across the political spectrum buzzed with reactions. On the right, conservative voices hailed Jasmine as a hero, someone who had exposed the deep-seated double standards and hypocrisy of the left. They praised her for remaining calm under fire, for turning the tables without so much as raising her voice. To them, she was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the political establishment, an outsider who had come in, not with force, but with the unassailable power of truth. But on the left, the reaction was less certain. Liberal commentators, who had once celebrated Booker as a beacon of progressive values, now struggled to defend him. The clip was being replayed endlessly across their social media platforms, and the looks of discomfort on Booker's face were undeniable. They had no choice but to acknowledge what had happened. Their champion had been exposed, and the moral high ground he had once claimed was now a distant memory. Yet even as some cautiously praised Jasmine's composure, others shifted uncomfortably. How could they spin this? How could they defend the man who had so publicly faltered? The media chaos that followed was something few had expected. Jasmine Crockett's response had done more than just silence her accuser. It had become the subject of an entire political debate. It wasn't just about who was right in the hearing anymore. It was about the larger narrative of who controlled the truth and how the media would process it. In the conservative press, her calm demeanor was painted as a masterclass in political combat. A number of prominent figures, from right-wing pundits to former politicians, lauded her for her ability to dismantle Booker's entire platform with little more than a few pointed questions. They celebrated her as the voice of reason in a world dominated by spectacle and emotion. "Jasmine Crockett shows how it's done," was a phrase that quickly became a rallying cry in the conservative sphere. Her steady, controlled response was the antidote to the outraged politics that had become all too common, and they weren't shy about spreading the message. On the other side of the political spectrum, however, the media landscape was far more divided. Liberal outlets that had once revered Booker's impassioned speeches and righteous indignation now faced the uncomfortable reality that they couldn't escape what had happened in the hearing. His frantic defensive response, contrasted with Jasmine's cool, calculated dissection, painted a stark picture of who had truly won the exchange. Some left-leaning commentators tried to soften the blow by deflecting the conversation back to the substance of the hearing, focusing on the policy issues, downplaying the personal revelations. But even they couldn't escape the underlying message. Booker had been thoroughly outclassed, not by a rhetorical juggernaut, but by someone who had shown him up through the sheer power of measured silence and impeccable timing. The viral nature of the clip didn't just stay within the confines of media elites and political commentators. Jasmine's victory had become a pop culture sensation. Memes of Booker's stunned face and Jasmine's calm response flooded the internet, shared and reshared by people from every walk of life. It was more than just a political victory. It was a moment that transcended party lines, touching something deeper about how we view strength, composure, and accountability in the political arena. The video was everywhere, from Twitter feeds to late-night shows, where it became a punchline in discussions about political confrontation. But beyond the viral nature of the clip and the media frenzy it sparked, what truly resonated with the public was the sense of injustice that had been so elegantly called out by Jasmine. She wasn't just defending herself, she was calling out a system that had allowed hypocrisy to go unchecked. The injustice wasn't just in what Booker had said, it was in how the political elite had been allowed to escape scrutiny for so long, only for Jasmine to pull back the curtain with a calm and undeniable precision. The public had watched her, not as a victim, but as someone who stood firm in the face of an attack that many would have crumbled under. And in doing so, she had turned the tables not only on Booker, but on the entire political establishment that had underestimated her. Jasmine Crockett's name was now cemented in the annals of political theater, not as someone who fought fire with fire, but as someone who used the quiet, unyielding power of truth to dismantle a well-crafted narrative. And the world was watching. The aftermath of the hearing unfolded like a thunderclap in a storm, the reverberations shaking the political landscape in ways that no one could have predicted. Booker, once the shining star of the Senate floor, found himself slowly fading into the background. The immediate effect was undeniable. Just days after the hearing, Booker's presence in the media began to shrink. Where he had once been invited to high-profile talk shows and news segments, now his phone remained silent. Public appearances, once a staple of his calendar, were being rescheduled or quietly canceled. The media that had once hung on his every word now seemed hesitant to engage. His moral authority had been shattered, and without it, his carefully cultivated public persona began to erode. His legislative proposals, particularly those he had championed in the wake of the hearing, were suddenly sidelined. The bills he had pushed so hard for, once seen as progressive wins, now found themselves gathering dust on the back burner. His calls for reform, once loudly applauded, were met with muted responses. Even his own party, which had once rallied behind him, now seemed reluctant to give him the same support. The very foundation he had built for himself was crumbling, piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But Jasmine's trajectory, on the other hand, was climbing. The moment the hearing concluded, her name began to resonate beyond the confines of the room. The media that had once been skeptical, that had reduced her to a side character in Booker's narrative, now found themselves clamoring to hear more from her. Invitations flooded in, not just from mainstream outlets, but from respected think tanks and legal organizations eager to hear her insights. Conservative think tanks, often known for their ideological opposition to progressive ideals, reached out to her with the kind of respect they had never offered before. They saw in her the clarity, the calm, and the integrity that could make her a powerful voice in shaping policy debates moving forward. Her reputation as a political force, someone who could take down powerful opponents with nothing but the truth, was cemented. In the days following the hearing, Jasmine was invited to testify as a witness in several upcoming hearings, her name now being placed alongside seasoned professionals and legal experts. For someone who had entered the political stage as an underdog, this was a monumental leap forward. She wasn't just invited to speak, she was now in demand, sought after by lawmakers and think tanks alike for her expertise. Her calm, calculated responses had given her credibility. A credibility that, in a world of sensationalized rhetoric and political theater, was more valuable than gold. Jasmine had done what many had thought impossible. She had turned the political tide with integrity and precision, outshining her most formidable critics. The contrast in their post-hearing trajectories could not have been more stark. Booker, once on the rise, had now seen his influence wane in the span of a few days. Jasmine, who had fought to be seen, had found herself elevated to new heights, not through loud declarations or emotional outbursts, but through the quiet force of truth. Booker had spent years crafting an image of moral superiority, but in one hearing, Jasmine had dismantled that image with the simplicity of facts and reason. Where Booker had once been the voice of the party, now it was Jasmine's calm, unflinching voice that resonated with the public. The contrast wasn't just in their careers, it was in the narrative of power itself. Booker had used his position to launch accusations, to tear down his opponents with fiery speeches and emotional attacks. But Jasmine, who had been the target of those same tactics, had responded with grace and facts. She had not risen through the ranks by outshouting others. She had risen by standing firm in the face of injustice, by demanding fairness even when the system was set against her. And now that strength was being recognized. It was a quiet revolution, a revolution built on the idea that integrity, truth, and composure were just as powerful as any bombastic speech or grandstanding display. As Booker's visibility continued to shrink, Jasmine's presence in political circles only grew. She was becoming a sought-after voice in the corridors of power. Her calmness under pressure had become her trademark. In a world where drama often took center stage, Jasmine had proved that composure and intellect could capture the public's attention just as effectively. She was no longer just a congresswoman from Texas. She was a force to be reckoned with, someone who could take on the establishment and come out victorious, not through force or intimidation, but through the sheer power of being right. In the weeks that followed, Booker's decline was visible in the press. Every mention of his name was now followed by reminders of the disastrous hearing, the moment when he had faltered in front of the cameras. The narrative that had once been about his progressive fight for justice had become about his loss of moral authority. Meanwhile, Jasmine continued to rise, speaking with clarity and purpose, engaging in the debates that mattered. The contrast was undeniable. The once rising star had been eclipsed, and the woman who had been dismissed as just another challenger had claimed her place at the table. In the world of politics, where narratives were everything, Jasmine Crockett had rewritten her own story, and in doing so, had shifted the balance of power. The reverberations of the hearing stretched far beyond the walls of the Senate. What had transpired in that room, once a battleground between two opposing political figures, had now become something more. A moment that would define careers and reshape narratives in ways no one had anticipated. Jasmine Crockett's calm yet decisive response to Booker's attack had not only altered the course of the hearing, it had altered the very nature of how power and truth were viewed in the public eye. It was a victory, yes, but it was also a powerful reminder of the value of composure, integrity, and the quiet strength of standing firm in the face of adversity. The political establishment had underestimated Jasmine, just as they had underestimated countless others who had fought for fairness and truth in a world that often ignored both. But her victory, so deftly achieved, was a lesson that would transcend the confines of Capitol Hill. A few months later, at a prestigious university, a political science professor stood before a group of eager students. As he lectured, he pulled up a slide on the screen. A moment that changed political trajectories. It was the clip. Jasmine Crockett, calm as the storm raged around her, methodically dismantling Booker's accusations, with nothing more than facts, poise, and patience. The professor, an expert in political strategy, paused for effect before continuing. This moment, while small in the grand scope of history, marked a turning point in political engagement. It was not about who shouted the loudest, who held the most influence, or who had the largest audience. It was about one woman who, despite being outnumbered, outmaneuvered her opponent not with force, but with integrity. The students watched, captivated, as the professor dissected the sequence of events, showing how the power dynamics had shifted. How Booker, once seen as a political giant, had been brought to his knees by the quiet force of truth. He explained how Jasmine's response became not just a defining moment in her career, but a pivotal lesson for those who came after her. It was a lesson about the often overlooked power of remaining composed, of standing up for truth in a system that so often rewards spectacle over substance. As the lecture continued, the professor highlighted how Jasmine's actions had struck a nerve in the political world. Her calm, her ability to stay focused and grounded, had defied every expectation placed upon her. In a political landscape where the loudest voices often dominate, where media cycles are driven by outrage and conflict, Jasmine's moment reminded everyone in the room of something fundamental, That quiet strength, clarity, and unwavering commitment to the truth can be just as, if not more, powerful than any rhetoric. The students, many of whom had come to study politics with the belief that it was a world governed by noise, aggression, and spectacle, now saw a new path laid before them. They saw that real change often comes not from battling the system with more noise, but from having the courage to stay true to one's principles, even when the odds seem insurmountable. The professor made it clear, Jasmine had not only won a political battle, she had changed the framework of how battles in politics would be fought from now on. It wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a cultural one. Her response became a touchstone, a model for anyone looking to challenge the status quo without resorting to the same tactics of division, anger, and fear. The lesson went deeper than politics. It was about the power of personal integrity, the courage to stand alone, and the belief that truth could be a weapon far more potent than any slander or attack. The impact of that hearing stretched beyond Capitol Hill, making its way into textbooks, academic journals, and political discourse across the nation. The story of Jasmine Crockett and Cory Booker was no longer just about two figures battling over policy. It was about the larger fight for integrity in an era where integrity often seems to have little place. And as the professor closed the lecture, he left his students with a final thought. In the end, power is not about who shouts the loudest. It's about who holds the line when the world expects them to break. And in that room, as Booker's character was torn down and Jasmine's was elevated, that lesson had been made clear for all who were paying attention. In a world where political battles are often fought in the spotlight, where loud voices and sensational headlines are prized above substance, one lesson had become abundantly clear. The calm, the prepared, and those who know exactly when to strike will always come out on top. Jasmine Crockett had been thrust into the center of a political firestorm, an arena where every word was scrutinized, every gesture magnified, and every move taken to be a sign of weakness or strength. Yet what she had done in that Senate hearing, in front of millions of viewers, was nothing short of remarkable. She didn't fall for the theatrics, the grandstanding, or the high-pitched emotional outbursts that often dominate political discourse. Instead, she used her greatest asset, silence. And in that silence, she displayed the kind of composure and strategic thinking that would be the model for future political confrontations. As the hearings wore on, the world watched as Booker, once seen as a towering figure, unraveled before their eyes. His earlier confidence, built on years of impassioned speeches in political capital, began to dissipate as Jasmine remained calm under fire. Each time he tried to strike, she countered with a precision that left him scrambling for words, his arguments falling apart in the face of her unwavering logic. She had prepared for this moment, not by crafting a grandiose speech or rehearsing fiery rebuttals, but by knowing exactly what needed to be said, and more importantly, when to say it. Booker, for all his grand rhetoric, had been the one who could not maintain control. His emotional intensity, while it had served him in other moments, had now become his downfall. It was as if the more he pushed, the more he revealed his own weaknesses. The more he tried to dominate the conversation, the more he exposed his own hypocrisy. Meanwhile, Jasmine's calm, collected responses, backed by hard evidence and reason, made her the quiet force in the room. In an era where louder voices often won out, Jasmine's poise, her strategic thinking, and her ability to pick her moments were the weapons that defeated the overwhelming force of spectacle and noise. This was the true power dynamic at play in today's politics. The spectacle of outrage, the play for emotional dominance may win short-term battles, but it is the ones who are prepared, who can handle the heat and take their time before striking with precision, who will claim victory in the long run. Jasmine's calculated responses, her ability to remain composed under pressure, were not the reactions of someone who was playing catch-up. They were the moves of someone who had already figured out the game. She wasn't just participating in this hearing, she was mastering it. And the lesson for everyone watching was clear. In the age of performance politics, those who understand the value of silence, preparation, and timing will always hold the upper hand. For Jasmine, the attack was personal. She had been targeted, her character assassinated in front of a room full of political power players and millions of viewers. She had faced the full brunt of a political opponent who believed that sheer force of will and emotion could carry him to victory. And yet she had endured, remaining calm, even when her opponent tried to tear her down. This wasn't just a battle over policy. It was a battle over character, integrity, and the very principles of fair play. Jasmine had been asked to prove herself in a system designed to crush her. She had been questioned, insulted, and doubted. Yet in the end, it was her ability to stay composed, her unshakable commitment to truth, and her understanding of the right time to make her move that gave her the ultimate advantage. As the media swarmed to cover the aftermath of the hearing, the narrative began to shift. Booker's emotional outbursts were dissected, the cracks in his moral high ground exposed. Meanwhile, Jasmine's steady, calculated responses became the gold standard for political discourse. The contrast was stark. Booker had fought to be seen as the moral champion, but it was Jasmine who had emerged as the true leader. The world was watching, and it had seen exactly what had happened. The loud, brash tactics of spectacle had been outmaneuvered by the quiet, powerful force of someone who was simply better prepared. The lesson was universal. In the high-stakes arena of politics, those who thrive are not necessarily the ones who shout the loudest, but those who are the most strategic, the most prepared, and the ones who know how to play the long game. This was the type of leadership the world needed, not driven by emotion or outbursts, but grounded in principle, truth, and the ability to seize the right moment. Jasmine had proven that the game was not only about winning battles, but about controlling the narrative, understanding when to strike, and knowing when silence was the most powerful weapon. In the end, it was her unwavering ability to stay true to herself, to the facts, and to the bigger picture that ensured she would be the one to rise above the noise and claim the high ground. In an age where the loudest voices often drown out reason, Jasmine Crockett had shown the world that true power lies in those who know how to rise above the fray. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.